All right, hello everybody. My name is Maarten de Kroos, and today we're going to talk about SBTi-aligned reduction targets. Now, who am I? I am Maarten de Kroos. I am the marketing lead for Climate Camp, and today I'm going to take you through what it means to set reduction target, what it takes, what are the frameworks, what is required of you to do so, and what are the implications for your company. Now, before we get started, I want to make some important notes. The first one being Climate Camp is not an SBTi partner. Reduction is what we focus on. Our goals is to help companies reduce scope 3, and setting targets is a very important aspect in that journey. Now, SBTi remains the leading standard in setting reduction targets. There are others which you could also use, but seeing as this is the standard, this is also why I wanted to focus on it during this webinar. You can still set, as the title of the webinar said, SBTi-aligned targets without following the validation process, which omits a bit of the costs and as well the scrutiny that comes with setting SBTi targets. But then you don't get the value of publicly communicating that you are SBTi committed or SBTi that you have targets set. Now, the second point I wanted to make is that this webinar is a general introduction and a high-level overview. What do I mean with that? We have 45 minutes, a small hour to talk about reduction targets. If I could tackle the entire body of work that is reduction targets in an hour, I think it would save a lot of people a lot of time. But this is more to give you a general idea of what reduction targets mean, what it takes when it comes to work, the impact on certain industries or certain requirements that come with it. It is a very nuanced topic, just as GHG inventories are. So our experts, for example, really guide our customers in helping them set these reduction targets, and they offer also detailed and sector-specific guidance. One of my colleagues is in the chat today, so if you have questions during the webinar regarding certain SBTi aspects, you can always put it in the chat or in the Q&A section, which is on top, and then I will answer it at the end of the webinar, or my colleague will do it during the webinar if she can. Now, let's get started. So what are we going to talk about? First, I'm going to give a general introduction into SBTi to give you a bit of an idea who it is as a company or organization, but also how many companies are committing to SBTi and so on. Then we'll go to the actual work that comes with reduction targets. So what is the process? How do you create a GHG inventory? The importance of data quality, the two methods SBTi uses, absolute contraction and sectoral decarbonization. And then what are the different rules related to target setting, the different types of targets you can set, as well as how to establish your baseline and target year. And then we'll also talk a bit about the corporate net zero standard and costs related to it. We'll also talk about two exemptions to the corporate framework, let's call it, of SBTi, which is the SME routes and companies within flag-intensive industries or flag emissions related industries. These are exemptions to the general rule. There are more than these, but these are the most prevalent for our customers as well as companies we talk to during the sales process. So let's dive in. Now, what is SBTi? A short introduction. The Science Based Targets Initiative, it's a global corporate climate action organization. It helps companies and financial institutions take measurable, science-aligned steps to combat the climate crisis. Now, their mission is to drive science-based climate action consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the climate goals of the Paris Agreement. What they do is they provide the standards, tools, guidance needed to set these targets and reduction pathways for near term, but as well corporate net zero towards 2050. They are not a consultancy. They are an information hub as well as a validation center for validating your targets. Now, who is SBTi? It was founded in May 2014 by the organizations which you see here: CDP, UN Global Compact, We Mean Business Coalition, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. They are registered as a charity in England and in Wales, and their subsidiary, SBTi Services, is the company that delivers the validation services. Now, why do they need to incorporate to that degree? Well, it's very important to think about how has SBTi grown over the last couple of years and how large is it today. So this number, it's over 12,000, I think, today, businesses that have targets and commitments, with the largest bulk being near-term targets. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side, this number has grown exponentially in the last couple of years. Between 2022 and 23, it was a 60% growth. Between 23 and 24, it was a 40% growth. For 2025, these numbers were only taken halfway in the year. It was also 15 to 20% growth already, and it is still increasing. As you can see, commitments have stayed more or less the same, but especially the corporate net zero standard for 2050 has grown by an impressive amount, as well as the proportion of near-term targets. Now, who are these companies? Well, let's take a look at the figure you see on the left-hand side, which is the distribution of SBTi targets across the world. And as we all know, Europe is one of the climate leaders when it comes to carbon reduction and reduction target setting. Over half of the targets set in SBTi are European targets. Now, there is nuance to this, because on the right-hand side, you can see the growth of which countries have set targets. And for the last, between 2023 and 2025, Asia has been catching up rapidly. China is the biggest growth of SBTi targets, but we might be the continent with the most targets, but the country with the most targets is Japan, which you can also see in this ranking here. I think they have, if I'm not mistaken, they have over 2,500 companies committed to SBTi. So the growth for SBTi is real. It is still heavily ongoing. So it is relevant for your industry and your markets as well. Why? The question that often comes up, if not to save the planet, then why? Because all these investments in time and resources need to be explained somehow. They need to be reasoned. And I would wish that saving the planet or reducing carbon in the atmosphere was a good enough reason, but we often need business cases to help support these actions as well. So carbon reduction in general and carbon reduction targets will help manage and reduce financial risk related to carbon taxes, such as EU ETS 1, 2, or CBAM. You might think ETS 2 has been postponed with a year. Yes, that is true, but ETS 1 is ticking on. Another 4% reduction in the total allowances will tick between 2025 and 26, increasing the price of carbon in the energy sector and the other related sectors. CBAM will kick into effect in 2027. Yes, they limited its scope, but the total amount of imported goods which are applicable, it's, I think, 98% from their previous amendment. So the cost related to complying to these regulations, the cost related to paying for these carbon taxes will only go up. So that means if your value chain is dirty or has a lot of carbon inherent in it, it will eat away at your margins. I think rising and volatile energy prices is not new to people here. 2020 was a clear, and the war in Ukraine and Russian dependency on Russian gas has shown that we have very volatile energy prices in certain cases. So this, combined with supply chain risks, droughts, hurricanes, disruptions to certain supply chains, can cause major financial risks. Carbon reduction also creates an incentive to develop and source lower carbon products to prepare your company for a lower carbon to net zero economy. We need to start reducing, which means larger companies will have to source lower carbon goods, which means the supplier that can supply these goods will rise in preferential treatment. To give you an example, here you can see different examples. Unilever is asking the entire body of its supplier to measure their emissions. Volvo Trucks is buying lower CO2 emission steel. Gillian, a Belgian chocolate brand, is sourcing more recyclable plastic or packaging in general. So as you can see with these examples, they are looking to source more lower carbon goods. So if you are a company that can provide these goods, then you can position yourself better in the future economy. Carbon reduction targets also help you receive preferential lending terms or access to financial resources. Across the globe, venture capitalist funds or VCs have shown that they are embedding sustainability metrics in their eligibility criteria for lending or financial instruments. There are also 304 financial institutions on SBTi, and they have to reduce through their portfolio. So that means there are banks like BNP, Degroof Petercam, other financial institutions, which have to reduce through their portfolio, which means they will extend preferential lending terms to their companies. Now, Let's talk about the SBTi process. So the SBTi process takes about 6 steps in setting reduction targets. The first one, pretty straightforward. You register, you create an account via the SBTi services validation portal. Then you fill out some initial details. Now, the second step is a bit special because it's voluntary. You can go straight into setting your targets if you have done all your homework. But this is a sort of commitment that you can communicate, and then it starts a clock which says within here and 24 months, I need to set targets and I need to communicate them publicly. SMEs also skip this stage, but I will come back to this later. Then you develop your targets. You need to prepare a GHG inventory. You need to prepare your targets, which means collecting data, getting buy-in from stakeholders, not only within your own company, but also in your value chain. Establish a timeline for delivering these results and account for the direct and indirect costs. Direct costs, I will come back to later. Now, if you're curious how SBTi evaluates this target setting, they have a document which is 200 pages long, which has criteria assessment indicators. It's like KPIs to establish that your targets are well documented, your GHG inventory is well documented, what it needs for certain industries. So they use this as a sort of report card to evaluate every target submission. Then you go towards submits. Submits is the validation process where it's sort of like an audit process where they will check your homework, where they will check your GHG inventory, your targets, if it is done properly, if everything is properly documented, if your base year is representable, and so forth. And there is some back and forth with the reviewer after initial submission, so you can process remarks, similar to an audit process for example, your GHG inventory. Then you communicate it. So you are listed on the SBTi targets dashboard after your targets have been validated. And then you can ask to delay communication of this for 6 months with SBTi to align your own communication with it. That's pretty straightforward. Then the disclose aspect, once you set targets, you need to deliver your homework yearly to SBTi. You need to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and you also need to disclose your progress towards reduction targets. Now, it is important to note they recommend using common disclosure methods like CDP or CSRD rules, etc., but you are not required as long as you document your scope 1, 2, and 3 totals and your reduction progress. Now, let's start with thinking about setting reduction targets. The first step is creating a GHG inventory. Now, this is a webinar topic in and of itself. That's why I have linked webinars I've given in the past on calculating scope 3 category 1 purchase goods and services. I've also done scope 3 category 4 and 9. We also help our companies with GHG inventories. So I'm going to skip over this step, but obviously this is the base point for any reduction targets or other reduction action. Now, I want to stand still a little bit with the importance of data quality, or I want to emphasize the importance of data quality. It is something that SBTi emphasizes throughout their documentation as well. And they say they push the use of primary data for the most significant emission sources in your value chain. So they really recommend it to do it for the most significant emission sources, which in most companies are purchase goods and services, transport if possible. But they say, okay, yeah, only use secondary data, so industry average emission factors, when it is not possible to retrieve primary data. So when you use the secondary data, you must document methodology, assumptions, data quality, and the plan to improve data quality over time. You see the image on the left-hand side. This is an image of SBTi that says when you do value chain mapping, who are your suppliers, where are your emissions coming from, it will help you better screen your scope 3 categories, and then you can use more and more primary data to improve your calculations. So it is a continuous data quality improvement process. And this is something important to take into account because the reliability, the representativeness, completeness, and consistency of your data, your GHG inventory, are all factors that SBTi is going to consider when they are reviewing your inventory and when they're reviewing your targets. I also did a webinar in the past on supplier engagement and how it can help improve primary data share. I've linked it here and I will send the slides after the webinar as well. So improve the use of primary data when you can to work with more realistic and more representable numbers. Now let's talk about how SBTi developed its methodology for carbon reduction and setting carbon reduction targets, they use two methodologies. The absolute contraction method, which is they simulated a bunch of scenarios, hundreds of scenarios, with the 1.5 degrees scenario, with the well within 2 degrees Celsius scenario, and then said, okay, for everybody is equal. A company must cut its total absolute emissions by a fixed percentage aligned with the global 1.5 degrees pathway. So regardless of company growth or output, this number of carbon reduction needs to happen, and it applies it to all companies and focuses purely on total tons reduction of CO2 equivalent. Most of you might know these numbers. So the corporate near-term criteria are 42% for scope 1 and 2 and 25% for scope 3. And by net zero, so 2050, we need to have 90% reduction across all scopes. Maybe a small remark before we go further. Here I'm going to focus on the corporate standards. SME I will come back to later, and financial institutes are a whole other game. So I'm not going to talk about financial institutions, but this is all related to corporate standards or corporate target setting. So the absolute contraction method is we have a certain carbon budget. This needs to go down. We are equally responsible in reducing this. So this is the reduction you need to effectuate. But we have a second one, sectoral decarbonization approach. What does this mean? It means that SBTi developed for near-term targets a methodology that takes nuances into account depending on which industry you are. And what does that mean? They created separate guidances. For example, you can see it's construction, forest, land and agriculture industries, financial institutions, cement, steel, land and maritime transports. And they still have guidance and development for chemicals, power generation, oil and gas, apparel and automotive. Now, why do they have different rules? Because depending on the makeup of their industry, their impact on total emissions, their rates or the reduction potential of their industries, they created nuances towards these industries. To give you some examples, power generation must reduce quicker than the global average because it is the largest effect on total emissions. Aviation and cement can reduce slower than the global average. I don't know why. There will probably be a good reason for it. But also industries that have large amount of flag emissions need to set additional targets, which I will come back to at the end of this presentation. And small and medium enterprises get a separate pathway to bypass commitment stage and easier validation to incentivize more SMEs to commit to targets without having the same costs and resources related to it. Now, target setting rules. When we set targets for scope 1 and 2 as a corporate, targets must cover 95% of operational emissions. For scope 3, this is important because 95% of operational emissions, that's almost all of your scope 1 and 2. But for scope 3, it is really important that you measure when your value chain emissions exceed 40% of your total carbon footprint. So scope 3 makes up more than 40% of your total CCF. Then you need to set scope 3 targets. And this scope 3 targets, or multiple targets, I'll come back to this later, must cover 67% of your total scope 3 emissions. Now, when setting targets, you have a minimum level of ambition. For scope 1 and 2, there is no choice. It's limited to the 1.5 degrees warming potential. For scope 3, you have the option to limit to scenario well within 2 degrees warming potential, but obviously a more stricter 1.5 degrees pathway is also possible. But these are the minimum levels of ambition SBTi requires for the different scopes. Now, what types of targets do we have? How can we compose targets to create a total reduction target across your entire GHG inventory? First, we have scope 1 and 2, which only has 2 targets. Either you set an absolute target, so aiming to reduce total emissions by an absolute amount on average per year, so 4.2% over 10 years, 8 points, so many percentage over 5 years, for example, or somewhere in between. This is pretty straightforward. The renewable energy target is only for scope 2. So when you source electricity, you can make a commitment to actively source a certain percentage from renewable energy, and this then covers your scope 2 target or your scope 2 purchased electricity target. Something interesting to note here, I've had a conversation recently with an energy intensive company, and they have inherently already a reduction target which they have to adhere to. So for example, if you make glass or if you make steel, etc., you are already under ETS 1. So they are paying for allowances, they are paying for carbon taxes. So they have an inherent reduction pathway for their scope 1 and 2 already. These companies think about setting reduction targets, but then it's mostly focused on scope 3 reduction as ETS is already forcing them to reduce scope 1 and 2. So this is important to keep in mind for if your company is within the high energy business. Then we have scope 3 targets. Now, scope 3 targets, there are multiple targets, 4 of them, or 3 according to the icons. You can choose between absolute targets, intensity targets, or supplier and customer engagement targets. Now, I will talk about it that you can combine these a bit later, but to give a quick view, absolute targets is the same as scope 1 and 2. You have to reduce the total amount of emissions by an absolute amount on average per year. And then the intensity target is you reduce a certain amount of emissions, but it is related to a specific economic or business metric. So emissions per gross product sold, emissions per ton kilometers, goods transported, per gross profit. So intensity based is a second target you can set. Then supplier engagement targets and customer engagement targets. These are the special kind of targets because they're qualitative as well as quantitative. But here you need to set a certain percentage of suppliers to setting science-aligned emission reduction targets. Why do I say it is qualitative and quantitative? It's qualitative because you're not actually reducing emissions by getting your companies or your suppliers on SBTi, but indirectly, and this is the quantitative aspect, because they have to set reduction targets, they will have to start reducing their scope 1, which means reduction on your scope 2, scope 3 for you, as well as their scope 3, further enhancing the reduction on your scope 3. So it's more of an indirect target the way you can look at it, especially for purchased goods and services. This is really important because your emissions come from the goods you purchase. There's not much influence you can have there except working with your suppliers. Now, do you need to have one scope 3 target to rule them all? And that is not necessary because you can combine targets as long as they collectively combined, they cover more than 67% of your scope 3 emissions. You need to have one target max per GHG category with the exemption of flag targets, but this is a little bit later in the presentation. And here I gave a short example. For example, purchased goods and services is 40% of your emissions, well, of your scope 3 emissions. Well, there you put a supplier engagement target to, let's say, engage with 75% of your suppliers to get them on SBTi. Then for use of sold products, 25% of emissions, you set an absolute reduction target. And then for transport, which is 10% of your emissions, you set an intensity target. For example, I'm going to reduce by X amount per ton kilometer we transport our goods. Because these three together cover 75% of your scope 3 emissions, this is covering your scope 3 emissions total with different targets and is allowed by SBTi. Now, another important aspect, we talked about the different target types. We've talked about the target rules when it comes to how much coverage, the minimum level of ambition for the reduction targets. Now, base year is also an important element to reduction targets. What year are you going to base your reduction on? Now, there are some SBTi guidelines, obviously. So companies are encouraged to set the most recent year with available data as the base year because it's more representable the closer it is to reality. It should also be representative of your company's total GHG profile. So for example, if your company had a large impact, like most companies from COVID, then 2020 and even a part of 2021 is not representative. Suppose you've increased your revenue by 50% or you lost a lot of revenue during a certain year and all the rest is stable, then you also cannot take that year as a base year because it's not representative of your normal GHG profile. Now, the emissions also need to be well documented. You will not be allowed to set targets if your scope 3 is hardly documented and you will have to set scope 3 targets, for example. If it's not well documented, you're not going to get your targets validated. The choice of base year must be no earlier than 2015, but most companies are setting base years for, let's say, the last 5 years. Scope 1 and 2 targets must use the same base year, and scope 3 targets are also recommended to use the same base year, but you're not required to. But most companies set base year for scope 1, 2, 3 in the same year. Base years across scope 3 categories have to be the same. So scope 1 and 2 can differ from scope 3, but within scope 3, it needs to be the same base year. Absolute and intensity-based emission reduction near-term targets. You need to set the target near-term for either a minimum of 5 years or a maximum of 10 years from the date the target is submitted to the SBTi for validation. Now, I want to make one small remark here, which was given to me by one of my colleagues. Suppose you set a base year and you had a year that you did a heavy investment in solar panels, power purchase agreements, green power, etc. You will receive a correction because you set a reduction target. For example, in 2022, I set my base year. And then in 2023, I did the investment in solar panels. Then I already achieved a lot of reduction for my scope 1 and 2. So my work is done, right? SBTi is strict on this. Say they will correct that you have to reduce more than if you take that base year into account, because they want to incentivize as much reduction as possible. These are the nuances why you can choose to go for SBTi-aligned targets next to the costs, because there are certain strict rules when it comes to SBTi. It's a sort of trademark for the quality of your reduction targets. Now, some FAQs when it comes to base year. It can be that you need to update your base year inventory. When? In a couple of cases. You've acquired other businesses that have separate GHG inventories. You divested organizations, so they're not in your portfolio anymore, releasing your responsibility over their GHG inventory. You merged with other businesses, which alters your GHG inventory, or you made major adjustments to calculation methodologies. So spend-based to activity-based, the large difference in primary data use in your activity-based methodology. But the general rule is if these changes impact more than 5% of your total inventory, you are required to update your base year. So take that into account for choosing your base year, as well as if it has to be updated after submission. Now, I'm not going to demo a lot in ClimateCamp today. I'm just going to show a couple of little things. What we do for our customers, we help them also prepare for setting scope 3 targets. And to do that, we help them scope the potential for supplier or customer engagement. We do an initial screening of their suppliers covering more than 67% of their emissions. And then it can show you the potential for using this target. Have they already target set? Can this be taken into account? So I'll quickly show. In ClimateCamp, you can go to Explore. We scrape all companies from SBTi, ADEME, places where they have communicated that they have reduction targets. And you can create a list. For example, I made a couple of lists here. And you can create a list and add companies. Most of these companies are demo account companies, but you can see if they have target sets. And if they have target sets, you can also see what their targets are. For example, this is a demo account, but here you can see what near-term targets they have set, or if they already share organizational footprint data, for example. Here we can see that this company already shares organizational footprint data. This is how we help for the first step, doing a little bit of exploration before we even engage with suppliers. You can see, okay, these companies already have targets or they don't. But when we actually engage with suppliers and send collaboration requests, we start receiving their data, PCFs. We're starting to validate their reduction targets. Then you can see, and then we go to the reduce tab. For example, here, this is a demo account, but we can see the impact on the total footprint these organizations have. It's pretty straightforward here. There's only 3 companies. But here you can see, okay, this company is this much impact. So if only this company sets an SBTi target, I already cover the supplier engagement target requirements. Obviously, for most companies, this is 10, 20, 30, 40 companies, but you can easily use the collaborators tab to see which companies amount to 67% of your GHG inventory. You can also check your supplier maturity to see overall absolutely. How many of my companies or my suppliers already have CCF, PCF, or reduction targets and have verified numbers? So Climate Camp helps you with the scoping before we do supplier engagement of how viable it is, what are the companies and their impact on your total footprint before you set a supplier engagement target. Let me quickly go back. All right. Then, okay, this is the supplier engagement target. Then I want to quickly talk about corporate net zero. Now, why did they launch the corporate net zero guidance in 2021? And okay, the question is why? Because there was lacking a common definition for net zero. What does that mean? Some people are talking about net zero. What requires net zero? Do we talk about carbon neutral? Can you offset emissions? Can you mitigate? Can you remove? What with sequestration? So there were no standard pathways for reaching the net zero goals, and SBTi wanted to create a standard for setting these targets. The rules are obviously more stringent than they are for the near-term targets. For example, the target year must be 2050 or earlier. You need to have 90% absolute emissions reductions across scopes 1 to 3 for everybody. So for corporates, for SMEs, for all scopes, 90% reduction. And you can only use the absolute contraction method. So there is no sectoral decarbonization approach for long-term net zero targets. And only the residual 5 to 10% can be neutralized with removal. But SBTi documents, if you do beyond value chain mitigation, if you invest in projects for offsetting, etc., it is allowed, but it does not reduce your scope 1 to 3 emissions or help you meet your reduction targets. And they're busy with a draft for a second publication going on now. You can ask to be part of that if you have relevant inputs. And there are also new standards being developed for the chemical sector, automotive, power, and apparel, which I listed before. And now let's talk a bit about costs. As I mentioned before, we are not an SBTi partner. I can talk about this and give the advice that SBTi is a great framework. It's the standard. You can use it to communicate your commitments, but it comes with costs. It comes with costs indirectly and directly. Indirectly, okay, GHG inventories, let's assume that everybody is working towards corporate carbon footprinting, communicating this, disclosing it under VSME, CSRD, or just on your own in the coming years. So GHG inventory setting, it takes some resources and time to do so. But reductions, defining the reduction targets also takes some indirect costs, as well as you need to define reduction pathways for reaching your goals. So it's not just filling in a paper, it's not just filling in a document. You really need to make plans how you will reach these targets. These are the indirect costs, but as you can see, there are different direct costs related to validating your targets, making updates to your targets. So I do want to give this as information. You can set SBTi-aligned targets. You follow the methodology. You make it as good as possible and as close as possible to the requirements of SBTi, but you don't do the standard validation. And in turn, you don't get to communicate that you are SBTi committed. So take it into account. It has costs. It is the standards, but you're not required to. We equally have companies that do SBTi-aligned targets because of these costs, because of the rules with regards to baseline year. Now, I mentioned so in the beginning, there are 2 exemptions, 2 special routes, 2 special subdivisions when it comes to target setting. One being SMEs, the second being flag-intensive industries. The SME route, it's what it says, small and medium enterprises. If you meet the eligibility criteria, you will have less strict requirements when it comes to target setting. You have different targets, so there are some different nuances if you're a smaller company. Why does SBTi do this? Because they want to have as many companies as possible commit to reduction, and this lowers the threshold for smaller companies which don't have the same level of resources that corporates have. So you're eligible to use the SME routes if you have less than 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent across scope 1 and location-based scope 2 emissions. I forgot to erase my comments, but this talks about the base year. So this 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent is regards to the base year. You are also not a financial institution. You're not in the oil and gas sector. You also are not required to set sector-specific criteria, which regards to the sectoral decarbonization approaches. And you're also not a subsidiary of a parent company when your combined businesses would fall into the corporate category. These are pretty straightforward. What are the more specific variables to take into account? You employ less than 250 employees, you have less than 50 million in turnover, you have less than 25 million in total assets. And you are not in a mandatory forest, land, and agriculture sector. If you are, you can still have the SME rules, but then you need to meet all three criteria. So the 250 employees, the 50 million, and 25 million in assets. You need to comply with all these if you're in the flag sector as SME. What does it mean? Companies eligible for the SME route, you don't have to commit to set targets. You can just set targets. You don't have to set near-term Scope 3 targets. This is an important one, but you do have to commit to reduce Scope 3. You just don't have a specific reduction number, which is a bit like I'm going to do it, but I'm not defining how much I am reducing. But this is the requirement they set. And you do have to disclose your results, so your GHG inventory and your progress towards reduction. This route is much more straightforward, smaller inventories, fewer targets or less target limitations. So it's less time and less resources. And because of the more simple nature of the validation, the process also goes a lot quicker. Now, what targets do you set as an SME? You have two types of targets for near term, and you have two types of targets for net zero. Near term, it's the same as we've mentioned before, achieve a 4.2 absolute annual reduction each year, with a base year not before 2015, target year not further than 5 to 10 years. This is the general reduction target we know. What is the other near-term reduction target you can set, which is a near-term maintenance target? For some companies, you might be a drop shipper, you might not have sites with stationary combustion or mobile combustion, etc. You can commit to maintain that you have zero Scope 1 emissions or Scope 2 emissions, but most likely it's Scope 1 emissions, and that you are going to keep that at this level. This is the only other near-term target you can set. The long-term net zero targets, the same thing applies. So achieve absolute reductions in Scope 1, 2, and 3, reaching net zero, this 90% reduction, complemented by the related near-term targets. Net zero targets with a near-term time frame. This is if you want to go above and beyond. Here you commit to achieving net zero targets within 5 to 10 years. These are the only targets you can set as an SME. So it's pretty straightforward. Some small FAQs when it comes to the SME routes to calculate the emissions threshold. So there's 10,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. What calculation method do you use? Well, when it comes to Scope 2, you use location-based Scope 2 emissions, but that is only used to establish the emissions threshold. So if you're under this 10,000 or not, but when you start making your GHG inventory, you can use market-based as well. It's just location-based for the initial estimation. Do you have to follow the SME route if you are eligible for it? No, it's optional. You can adhere to corporate requirements as well, but it will come with the same level of commitments and targets and requirements. So you can do it, but it's optional to take the SME route. And now, do SMEs keep following SME standard if they outgrow limitations? You are very successful, you acquire companies. Well, no, once a threshold is passed, the targets and inventory must be updated to meet corporate requirements. I've linked the full FAQ of SBTi here, so if you have further FAQs, you can always check it in the slides afterwards. And that brings us to our final exemption or our final special industry, which is the Forest, Land and Agriculture Guidance, or FLAG. FLAG has, again, a lot of nuance, so I'm just going to give a high-level overview to give you a bit of an idea what the implications are. So why did they create a separate guidance for FLAG industries? It represents 22% of global emissions, so it's the third highest after energy production and industry, so it's really important. But also because of its impact on carbon sequestration. So if you, depending on deforestation, depending on how you use the land, not only do you create emissions by doing so, but you reduce the capacity of the earth to absorb carbon as well. So it creates an added effect. That is why they also created a separate guidance. And there was or is a lot of lacking data when it comes to land use change. So keeping the impact of these practices undervalued. That is why they created the flag guidance. Now, what are flag emissions? It has to do with, let's say, 5 different types. The first is the general land use change. So when you transform a land from one type into another, for example, if you turn wetlands into urban development, wetlands store a lot of carbon. Wetlands are able to store a lot of carbon. If you turn it into urban development, that has very severe consequences. So that is one type of flag emissions. Deforestation is one of the most known, I think, as well. If you cut trees to make room for agriculture or other developments, you create carbon with the deforestation itself, but the capacity for the earth to retain or sequester carbon is heavily reduced as well. So this has a very large impact. We will see later that almost 80% of the impact comes from deforestation under flag emissions. We also have agricultural activities as an important part of flag emissions. So you have certain activities which create a lot of emissions or that create emissions with a lot of global warming potential. Fertilizer use, methane production from livestock, these types of activities create an added effect on top of the general carbon generating activities. Soil degradation, maybe also not unfamiliar to the people in the agriculture business. Practices such as tilling, overgrazing of the grounds can release carbon stored within. And then the last one is forest management. So emissions coming from managing a forest, not just cutting it down, such as logging or burning stockpile, also generate flag emissions. Now, how to set flag targets? What does flag targets mean? Well, do you need to set flag targets next to your general reduction targets? Yes, but it's a bit more nuanced. So it's optional for SMEs unless meeting the requirements below, which I've said before. But it's primarily required in the following sectors. If more than 5% of your GHG emissions come from land and agriculture, which are the common ones: food production, so agriculture and animal source food production, food and beverage processing, food and staples retailing, and then everything that has to do with forest and timber. So forest and paper products, paper, pulp, and rubber. If you are in this industry and more than 5% of your emissions are related to land and agriculture, then you will have to set flag targets. It's also required in other sectors if more than 20% of their GHG emissions come from land and agriculture. So these are the requirements when you need to set flag targets. And an additional nuance, I mentioned before, deforestation is a lot of the impact within flag emissions. So the elimination of deforestation is a primary objective for setting flag targets. So if you have to set flag targets, you also need to publicly commit to no deforestation, covering all scopes with a target date no later than this year, December this year. Well, for the people in Europe in this webinar, obviously the EUDR already makes steps towards traceability of wood coming or certain goods coming from deforested areas. But if you commit to SBTi flag or have to commit to SBTi flag, you need to also commit to no deforestation. Now, how do flag targets, what do they look like? They need to be set in addition to the standard energy and industry science-based targets. So what does that mean? I've made an example here. You're a global food manufacturer. You have a split in your emissions between non-flag emissions and flag emissions. In this case, for example, the flag target will relate to all the agricultural purchase goods and the land use change emissions, while the energy and industry target will relate to scope 1 and 2 energy and all the non-flag scope 3 categories, transport, packaging, etc. Here you can see on near term, the flag target requires that you reduce by 30% by 2030 and reduce by 72% by 2030 from a 22 base year. This is the pathway or the requirements for flag targets are a bit different from the ENI targets. I've used the most general ones here. So this will be, generally speaking, you will set a 30% reduction target for near term and a 72 reduction target for net zero. I've changed, the base year needs to be 2050. I've forgot to update my slides. And the ENI target then follows the same methodology as I've mentioned before. Now, a last remark when it comes to flag, you have two types of pathways when it comes to flag. It's flag sector pathway or flag commodity pathway. What does this have to do? It has to do with, are you a demand organization? Are you buying or purchasing agricultural goods? or are you supplying them? So are you creating a lot of agricultural goods? For the flag sector pathway, it's demand-side organizations, the ones buying flag goods, so their emissions sit mostly in scope 3. And it also applies to supply-side organization, but they are not one of the 11 commodities, which I'm going to list below. The flag commodity pathway is for these high-emitting, high-impact commodities. So it's supply-side organization, which means their flag emissions will mostly sit in their scope 1. And the 11 major flag commodities are beef, chicken, dairy, leather, maize, palm oil, pork, rice, soy, wheat, and timber or wood fiber. So these are the commodities that follow a different pathway under flag. Demand sides may utilize these pathways if the commodity is responsible for 10% or more of their gross flag emissions. So that is the exemption for demand sides. That is the general introduction to SBTi targets, and also if you want to set SBTi-aligned targets, what the theory is behind it. I'm going to quickly stop sharing. I want to see if there are Q&A questions right now. Let's see. Are the costs, the question from Simon Mayet, are the costs related to, are they one-time costs or are they actually recurring costs? Well, in that case, they are one-time costs. But as I've mentioned, maybe I can share my screen again. Let's see, like this. Here you can see an update to your target, or when you need to update your flag targets, etc. Then the costs comes again. So they are not recurring costs, but dependent on if you need to change certain elements of it. All right. I noticed that in the SBTi database, companies taking action are listed under their parent company name. However, in practice, business is often conducted with a subsidiary that follows under the parent's commitment. How does the Climate Camp tool map or recognize these subsidiary companies? So SBTi as a rule says that you need to set their targets on the highest organizational level possible, that it then applies to everything below that level. So we follow a bit of the same methodology. The parent company will have the SBTi target, but the same target will be applied to every organization below, except if it has been documented or publicly communicated by the company how this differs within their organization. So if a certain part is more responsible for reduction, or if they have communicated the plan. But generally speaking, the same amount of reduction applicable for the parent company applies to its entire structure. Let's see what other questions. You mentioned a 42% reduction target for scope 1 and 2 emissions between 2020 and 2030. What happens if we want to set a target with an end year beyond 2030? Since 2030 is only 5 years away, it feels quite short term. Are there guidelines for targets beyond 2030? I might be mistaken, so maybe Gwendolyn can answer in the chat if it's so, but as I understand it, it's just a time frame from your base year to 5 to 10 years. So for example, we're still in 2025, so you cannot use this year because your emissions are not complete. So maybe it's 2024. So the first date or the nearest date for setting base year 2024 will be 2029, but you get a 5 to 10 year time frame. The near-term targets have more to do with in what speeds 5 to 10 years you reduce, rather than it has to be strictly within 2030. But I'll check with Gwendolyn, my colleague, later and answer that question or confirm that answer with you. Let me see if there are other questions right now. Scope 3 targets. Is it possible to set only supplier and customer engagement targets without setting absolute intensity targets? The reality of the situation is supplier and customer engagement targets especially relate to the categories relevant to them. So purchase goods and services or use of sold products. For these customer and or supplier engagement targets are very relevant, but absolute and intensity targets will be required for other scope 3 categories. It's not always possible For example, let's say transports, it's not the same for them to set supplier and customer engagement targets. There we see more absolute and intensity based targets. So it depends a bit. Certain targets are more applicable for certain scope 3 GHG categories. And I think there's one more question for personal care products from Tung Nguyen, but I'll answer that one directly because I will have to consult with my much more knowledgeable colleagues on SBTi target setting what the answer is here. So if these are the final questions for right now, I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar. I hope you find it insightful. In the coming days and weeks, I will also communicate what webinars we are going to do in 2026. I'm also going to invite a bit more customers and experts to talk about their journey, not only target setting, but GHG inventory, moving towards primary data collection, and these types of topics. If you are interested or want to learn more about a certain topic, you can always mail me at maarten@climatecamp.io or marketing@climatecamp.io. And I hope to see you people in the next webinar. Thank you very much.